My son looked me in the eye and said, "You're becoming a burden we can't afford," while his wife nodded like I was a piece of furniture they were tired of dusting. So they packed my belongings into garbage bags and left me standing in the rain outside a senior living facility I'd never seen before, telling me it was for my own good. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't helpless, I wasn't confused, and I damn sure wasn't finished. And when I finally played the hand life had secretly dealt me, they realized they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I'm 72 years old. For 43 years, I worked as a research librarian at the Multnomah County Central Library in Portland, Oregon. I knew how to find things that people thought were lost forever. I knew how to trace bloodlines through dusty records and uncover secrets buried in archives that hadn't been touched in decades. What I didn't know was that the most important discovery of my life would come from a cardboard box in my own closet, long after I thought my story was over. Until 6 months ago, I believed I knew exactly who I was. The widow of James Hartwell, a gentle man who sold insurance and died peacefully in his sleep 3 years ago. The mother of David, my only child, who worked as a software engineer and lived in a gleaming modern house in the Pearl District with his wife Vanessa and their twin daughters Sophia and Emma. I was the grandmother who brought homemade oatmeal cookies to soccer games, who read bedtime stories in different voices, who remembered every birthday and school play and scraped knee. I lived in the same modest craftsman house in southeast Portland, where James and I had raised David, where the maple tree we planted for his first birthday now shaded the entire front yard. The house where I'd organized neighborhood book clubs for 20 years, where the kitchen windowsill was lined with African violets that bloomed purple and pink, where every room held the comfortable weight of a life well lived. I had my routine's morning coffee while reading The Oregonian, tending my small garden of tomatoes and herbs, volunteering at the library's literacy program twice a week. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. David visited every few weeks, usually on Sunday afternoons. Vanessa would scroll through her phone while the girls played in my backyard, and David would sit at my kitchen table drinking coffee from the same blue mug he'd used since high school. We'd talk about his work, about the girls' activities, about whether I needed anything fixed around the house. He was dutiful in the way good sons are supposed to be, but there was always an invisible timer, ticking a sense that he was checking something off his list. Vanessa had never warmed to me, not in the 8 years since she'd married my son. She was beautiful in that effortless way that expensive yoga classes and regular spa treatments create with honey blonde hair that never seemed to frizz in Portland's drizzle, and clothes that looked casual, but probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She spoke to me with the careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives. You're obligated to tolerate her smile, never quite reaching her gray-green eyes. She'd comment on how quaint my house was, how nostalgic my furniture looked, how sweet it was that I still used paper books instead of a tablet. The trouble started after my fall. It was nothing dramatic, just a stupid accident on a January morning when I slipped on black ice walking to my car. I broke my left wrist and bruised my ribs, spent one night in the hospital for observation, and came home with my arm in a cast and instructions to take it easy for 6 weeks. David insisted on staying with me for the first few days, sleeping in his old room, helping me shower and dress, and navigate daily tasks with one functional hand. That's when Vanessa began her campaign. She started coming by every few days, ostensibly to check on me, but I could see her cataloging everything with those sharp eyes. She'd open my refrigerator and announce that my milk was 2 days past expiration, as if I couldn't read dates myself. She'd comment on the dust on my ceiling fan, the stack of books by my bed, the fact that I hadn't been keeping up with laundry while managing with one hand. She'd photograph things with her phone, claiming she was documenting my recovery. But something about the way she focused on any small mess or oversight made my skin crawl. Mom's struggling more than she's letting on. I heard her tell David one afternoon when they thought I was napping. They were in my kitchen, their voices carrying up through the heating vents to my bedroom. Look at this place. She's clearly overwhelmed. The bills are stacked up. There's expired food in the fridge. And yesterday, I found her reading glasses in the bathroom medicine cabinet. Who puts glasses in a medicine cabinet? She just broke her wrist, David replied, but his voice held less conviction than I wanted to hear. She's always been independent. She'll bounce back. David, honey, she's 72. This is what the beginning looks like. My grandmother went through the same thing. Little slips, little confusions, and then one day she left the stove on and nearly burned down her apartment. Vanessa's voice had taken on that reasonable, patient tone that people use when they're building a case. We need to start thinking about her safety, her future. There are excellent communities now, really nice places where she'd have help when she needs it, and social activities with people her age. I lay in my bed, heart pounding, listening to my son's wife plan my exile while I was 20 feet away. But what made my chest tight with panic wasn't just her words. It was that David didn't immediately shut down the conversation. He didn't say, "My mother is fine in her own home." He didn't say, "She raised me perfectly well in this house, and she deserves to stay here as long as she wants." Instead, he said, "Maybe we should look into some options just to have information." After that, the visits became evaluations. Vanessa would arrive with clipboard and measuring tape, claiming she was helping me organize. She'd go through my closets and declare that I had too many clothes, that the stairs to my bedroom were a safety hazard, that my car was too old to be reliable. She'd ask me the same questions repeatedly. What day it was, what I'd had for breakfast, whether I'd taken my medications. As if she were conducting some informal cognitive assessment. When I protested that I was fine, that I'd been managing my own life since before she was born, she'd exchange meaningful glances with David and suggest that denial was common in people experiencing changes. The worst part was watching my son transform before my eyes. David had always been a gentle, thoughtful person, someone who considered multiple perspectives before making decisions. But Vanessa had a way of presenting her opinions as logical conclusions that any reasonable person would reach. She'd cite statistics about elderly people living alone, mention news stories about seniors who'd fallen and couldn't reach help, reference articles she'd read about cognitive decline. She made my independence sound like reckless endangerment. "I just want what's best for you, Mom," David would say when I pushed back, and I could hear the echo of his wife's words in his voice. "We're worried about you being isolated here, about what would happen if you had another accident. At Sunset Gardens, there's always someone nearby if you need help, and you'd have built-in social connections. It's not giving up your independence, it's just accepting appropriate support. Sunset Gardens." I should have known from the name alone that it was the kind of place where people go to wait for death while pretending to live. David and Vanessa had toured it without telling me, had filled out preliminary paperwork, had put me on a waiting list for a one-bedroom unit with a kitchenette and a view of a courtyard where other discarded parents shuffled in circles for exercise. They presented it as an opportunity, a chance for a new adventure, where I could focus on enjoying life instead of worrying about maintenance and upkeep. What they were really saying was that I'd become inconvenient. That my house was too valuable to leave in the hands of someone who might leave glasses in the medicine cabinet. That my life had contracted to the point where I could be efficiently contained in 400 square feet with scheduled mealtimes and group activities led by cheerful college graduates who called everyone sweetie. I fought it, of course. I made lists of reasons why I was perfectly capable of living independently. I highlighted every news article about seniors thriving in their own homes. I pointed out that my neighborhood was full of people my age who managed just fine. But Vanessa had David's ear, and she'd convinced him that my resistance was exactly the kind of poor judgment that proved I needed supervision. Every argument I made was reframed as evidence of cognitive decline. Every example of my competence was dismissed as a lucky exception that wouldn't last. The end came on a gray March morning when I was still recovering from a minor bout of flu. I was in my bathrobe, hair unwashed, moving slowly, because my chest was still congested, and my energy hadn't fully returned. I'd planned to shower after breakfast, to put on real clothes, and tackle the stack of books that needed to be returned to the library. But at 8:30, David and Vanessa appeared at my door with a van and two men I'd never seen before. "We've moved your reservation date up," Vanessa announced, stepping past me into my living room like she owned it. "There was an unexpected opening, and we didn't want to miss this opportunity. The movers are here to help with your essentials, and we'll handle sorting through everything else later." I stood there in my bathrobe, watching strangers wrap my mother's china in newspaper, watching my son avoid my eyes as he supervised the dismantling of my life. "David," I said, my voice hoarse from the lingering cough. "Please don't do this. I'm fine. I just need a few more days to get over this bug." He finally looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my son's face. Not love or concern, but impatience. "Mom, you've been sick for a week. You haven't answered your phone twice when Vanessa called to check on you. You're not eating properly, the house is a mess, and you look like you haven't slept in days. This is exactly what we've been worried about." "I have the flu," I said, hearing my voice rise with desperation. "I'm not dying. I'm not demented. I have a common respiratory infection that millions of people recover from every year." But Vanessa was already directing the movers to pack my medications, my important documents, a few changes of clothes. "We'll bring more of your things once you're settled," she said without looking at me. "The important thing is getting you somewhere safe where you can recover properly." They drove me to Sunset Gardens in David's car, my hastily packed suitcase in the trunk. My life reduced to whatever they'd decided I might need in the immediate future. I sat in the passenger seat in my bathrobe and slippers, watching familiar neighborhoods disappear behind us, feeling like a kidnapping victim who was expected to be grateful for the service. David kept talking about amenities and activities, and how much I was going to enjoy having my meals prepared for me, but his voice sounded hollow, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Sunset Gardens looked exactly like what it was. A warehouse for warehousing inconvenient elderly people disguised as a resort. The lobby had the kind of aggressively cheerful decor that's supposed to make you forget you're trapped, all pastel watercolors and artificial plants, and motivational signs about aging gracefully. The staff spoke in the sing-song voices reserved for children and people they assumed were losing their mental faculties. My suite was clean and beige, and utterly without personality, like a hotel room designed by someone who'd given up on life. "You'll love it here, Mom," David said as he set my suitcase on the narrow bed. "Look, you've got a little kitchen area, and there's a library down the hall, and tomorrow they're doing a presentation about local history that I thought you'd enjoy." I sat in the room's single chair and looked at my son. Really looked at him. At some point during the past few months, he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a problem to be solved. The man who used to call me twice a week just to chat, who brought me flowers on Mother's Day, and remembered that I liked my coffee black and my eggs over easy, had been replaced by someone who could pack up my life and deposit me in a beige box without once asking what I wanted. "I'm not staying here," I said quietly. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice taking on that patient, patronizing tone she'd perfected. "Eleanor, I know this is an adjustment, but you'll feel better once you've had a chance to rest and meet some of the other residents. Mrs. Chen in 2B was a librarian too, and she's been telling everyone how excited she is to meet you." I looked past her to David. "I'm 72 years old, not 92. I've managed my own life for 7 decades. I'm not staying in this place." "Where else would you go?" Vanessa asked, and there was something almost triumphant in her voice. "You can't manage that big house by yourself anymore, and you don't have family nearby to help you. This is the practical solution." That's when it hit me. They'd burned my bridges. While I was recovering from the flu, while I was trusting them to help me, they'd been telling people I was having difficulties. My neighbors probably thought I'd been moved for my own safety. My friends from the library had likely been told I needed more care than I could get at home. David and Vanessa had carefully constructed a narrative where removing me from my life was an act of love, not abandonment. I didn't argue anymore. I hugged David goodbye, thanked Vanessa for her concern, and told them I understood they were trying to help. I smiled and nodded when the activities director explained the schedule, when the nurse reviewed my medication routine, when my sweet mate Mrs. Patterson explained the social dynamics of the dining room. I played the part of a grateful mother who recognized the wisdom of her children's decision. But that night alone in my beige box, with its scratchy sheets and air that smelled like industrial-strength disinfectant, I made myself a promise. I was going to get out of this place, and I was going to reclaim my life. I just had to figure out how. The answer came 3 weeks later in a manila envelope forwarded from my old address. Most of my mail was being filtered through David and Vanessa now, who'd helpfully arranged to handle my correspondence during my transition period. But this envelope was marked personal and confidential, and addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, so the Postal Service delivered it directly to Sunset Gardens. Inside was a letter from someone named Marcus Webb, who introduced himself as an estate attorney in Salem. He apologized for the delay in contacting me, explaining that it had taken time to track down my current address. His client, my great-aunt Cordelia Hartwell, had passed away 6 months earlier, and I was named as the sole beneficiary of her estate. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Great-aunt Cordelia, my grandfather's younger sister, whom I'd met exactly twice in my life, once at a family reunion when I was 8, and once at my grandfather's funeral when I was 23. I remembered a tall, sharp-eyed woman who wore expensive clothes and seemed faintly amused by our middle-class family gatherings. She'd never married, had no children, and as far as I knew, had spent most of her life traveling and collecting antiques. According to Marcus Webb's letter, Cordelia had built a successful business appraising and selling estate jewelry and collectibles. When she died, she owned a Victorian house in Salem's historic district, a warehouse full of carefully cataloged antiques and investment accounts worth just over $2 million. She'd left everything to me, along with a handwritten note that Marcus had enclosed with his letter. Dear Eleanor. The note read in Cordelia's spidery handwriting, I've been following your life from a distance, and I've always admired your independence and dignity. I know we barely knew each other, but blood is blood, and I'd rather my life's work go to someone who appreciates the value of beautiful things than to some distant cousin who'd probably sell everything at a garage sale. I hope this helps you live exactly the life you choose. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are. I sat in my beige chair in my beige room, holding a note from a woman I'd barely known, feeling like I'd been handed the keys to a kingdom I didn't know existed. $2 million. A house. A business. Freedom. But more than that, I had validation from someone who'd looked at my life and seen something worth investing in. Cordelia Hartwell had watched me from afar and decided I was someone who deserved to choose her own path. She'd given me the tools to prove that David and Vanessa had been catastrophically wrong about me. I called Marcus Webb the next morning and arranged to meet him in Salem the following week. I told the Sunset Gardens staff that I was going on a day trip to visit an old friend, which was true enough. David and Vanessa, when I mentioned it during their weekly duty visit, seemed pleased that I was making connections and getting out of my room. They had no idea I was about to reconnect with a fortune. The Victorian house on Court Street was everything I'd dreamed of when I was younger, and thought I might someday live somewhere grander than my modest craftsman. 3 stories of gingerbread trim and bay windows with a wraparound porch, and a garden that had been professionally maintained even after Cordelia's death. The warehouse behind the house was like a treasure trove, rooms full of furniture and artwork and jewelry, all carefully tagged and catalogued in Cordelia's meticulous handwriting. She was quite a businesswoman, Marcus explained as we walked through the inventory. Very particular about what she bought and sold. She had an excellent reputation among dealers and collectors. The business essentially runs itself at this point. She had standing relationships with estate sale companies, auction houses, even some high-end interior designers who relied on her to find specific pieces for clients. I stood in the middle of Cordelia's world, surrounded by beautiful things she'd spent decades collecting and curating, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement. Here was a life's work that mattered, a business built on knowledge and expertise and careful judgment. Here was proof that age could mean wisdom instead of decline, that an elderly woman could be formidable instead of fragile. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, pulling a sealed envelope from his briefcase. She left specific instructions about this. Inside was a photograph of a young woman who looked startlingly like me, along with a birth certificate and a handwritten family tree. The young woman was my grandmother Cordelia's sister-in-law, but the family tree revealed something I'd never known: my grandmother had been adopted. Her birth parents were listed as Margaret and William Morrison, wealthy Portland merchants who'd given up their daughter when scandal threatened their reputation. At the bottom of the family tree, Cordelia had written, "The Morrison family owned half of southeast Portland in the 1920s. Their descendants still hold significant property throughout the city. Eleanor, you have more roots in that neighborhood than you know." I spent the afternoon in Salem, walking through Cordelia's house, reading her business records, beginning to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. But more than money or property, she'd given me something invaluable: perspective. She'd seen my life from the outside and recognized something that my own son had missed. I wasn't a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. I was a person with resources and knowledge and the right to make my own choices. When I returned to Sunset Gardens that evening, I looked around my beige room with new eyes. This wasn't my home. This wasn't my life. This was a temporary inconvenience, a mistake that could be corrected. I had work to do. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. His name was Robert Chen, and he specialized in background checks and asset searches. I'd found him through the professional network I'd developed during my library career. One of the reference librarians at Portland State had recommended him when I called, asking for help with research for a writing project. I met him at a coffee shop near the university, and I was honest about what I needed. "My son and his wife convinced me to move into assisted living," I explained. "They used my temporary illness and some isolated incidents to build a case that I was incompetent. I want to know what they told people, what paperwork they filed, and what they're planning to do with my house." Robert was a serious man in his 50s who took careful notes and asked thoughtful questions. He didn't seem surprised by my situation, which was both reassuring and depressing. "This happens more often than you'd think," he said. "Adult children who decide their parents need protection and take steps without proper consent. Sometimes it's well-intentioned, but misguided. Sometimes it's more calculated." Within a week, Robert had a preliminary report. David had contacted my neighbors, my doctor, and several staff members at the library, where I'd volunteered, expressing concern about my welfare and asking them to call him if they noticed any signs that I was struggling. He'd researched guardianship laws and had preliminary paperwork prepared to seek legal authority over my medical and financial decisions if I continued to resist appropriate care. Most damning of all, he and Vanessa had met with a real estate agent to discuss the potential sale of my house. "They're not moving fast," Robert explained, "but they're laying groundwork. Your son seems to genuinely believe he's protecting you, but his wife is driving most of these decisions. She's been researching your property value, your assets, even your medical history. This isn't just about your safety, it's about control." I sat in that coffee shop reading a report that detailed how my son and daughter-in-law had systematically undermined my autonomy while I trusted them to help me recover from a broken wrist. They'd used my vulnerability against me, turned my temporary weakness into evidence of permanent incapacity. They'd convinced themselves that stealing my life was an act of love, but they'd made one crucial mistake: they'd underestimated me. They saw a 72-year-old woman who'd stumbled, and they assumed she'd fallen for good. They didn't see a research librarian who knew how to trace property records, a woman who'd just inherited the resources to fight back, a person who'd spent 4 decades helping people find information that others wanted to keep hidden. I moved out of Sunset Gardens on a Tuesday morning in April, while David and Vanessa thought I was attending a watercolor class. I'd spent 2 weeks quietly arranging everything, transferring my inheritance into local accounts, hiring a property management company, researching investment opportunities. Marcus Webb had recommended an excellent financial advisor in Portland, and together we'd developed a plan for managing Cordelia's legacy. More importantly, I'd found my new home. It was a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, transformed into luxury lofts for people who appreciated both historic character and modern convenience. The unit I bought had exposed brick walls, 15-foot ceilings, and windows that overlooked the Willamette River. It was sophisticated and urban, and absolutely nothing like the beige box my family had tried to confine me to. It was also 3 blocks from David and Vanessa's house, which felt like perfect symmetry. I left a note for the Sunset Gardens staff, thanking them for their care, and explaining that my circumstances had changed. I took a taxi to my new home, where movers were already unloading boxes of my belongings that I'd had retrieved from storage. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by my own things, my books, my mother's china, the photographs and artwork that told the story of my life. That evening, I called David from my new kitchen, where I was unpacking my grandmother's teapot and setting up a small reading area by the tall windows. "Mom!" His voice was tight with panic. "Where are you?" Sunset Gardens called and said you'd moved out. They said you left a note but didn't give them a forwarding address. We've been calling you all day. I'm fine, David. I've moved into a new place and I wanted to let you know I'm safe. A new place? What kind of place, Mom? You can't just leave without telling anyone. We're your family. We're supposed to help you make these kinds of decisions. I looked out my window at the city lights reflecting on the river, at the life I'd chosen for myself. Actually, you're not supposed to make my decisions at all. I'm a competent adult, and I can live wherever I choose. But Mom, we've been through this. You need support. You need people looking out for you. What happens if you fall again? What happens if you get sick? Then I'll handle it the way I handled everything else for 72 years before you decided I was helpless. My voice was calm, but there was steel in it that I'd forgotten I possessed. David, I love you, but you made a serious mistake. You took advantage of my trust when I was vulnerable, and you tried to solve a problem that didn't exist. There was a long silence. Then Vanessa's voice in the background. Ask her where she's getting money for a new place. Ask her if someone's taking advantage of her. I almost laughed. After everything they'd done, they were worried that someone else might be manipulating me. I'm not being taken advantage of, I said. I've inherited some money from a relative, and I've used it to secure appropriate housing. I've also hired an attorney and a financial advisor to help me manage my affairs. Everything is legal and documented and entirely within my rights. Inherited money. David's voice was sharp now. From who? Why didn't you tell us, Mom? This sounds like a scam. These people who target elderly? David. I cut him off. I'm going to hang up now. When you're ready to apologize for treating me like a child, when you're ready to acknowledge that you made decisions about my life without my consent, we can have a conversation. Until then, please don't contact me. I hung up before he could respond. Then I made myself a cup of tea in my grandmother's china teapot, settled into my favorite reading chair, and felt the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming my independence. But I wasn't finished. Taking control of my own situation was just the first step. David and Vanessa had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was powerless. Now, I wanted them to understand what they'd actually lost when they discarded me. The research took me 2 weeks, but 4 decades as a professional librarian had taught me how to dig deep into public records. David and Vanessa's house, their beautiful modern showcase in the Pearl District, was heavily mortgaged. They'd bought at the peak of the market, and taken out a second mortgage to fund renovations. David's tech company, while successful, was small and vulnerable to market changes. Vanessa's lifestyle, the yoga classes, the organic groceries, the private school tuition for the twins, required both their incomes and left them with very little financial cushion. More interesting was the property history of their neighborhood. The Pearl District had been industrial warehouses until the 1990s, when developers began converting the area into upscale housing. But underneath the modern facade, there were still pockets of older buildings properties that had been overlooked during the initial gentrification wave. One building in particular caught my attention, a 6-unit apartment complex, just 4 blocks from David's house, built in the 1920s, and currently being managed by an elderly owner who was ready to retire. The building was profitable, but tired the kind of property that needed an investor with both vision and patience. The current owner, William Patterson, was asking a fair price and seemed more interested in finding the right buyer than maximizing profit. We met for coffee, and I liked him immediately. He was a retired teacher who'd bought the building 30 years earlier as a retirement investment. "I could probably get more money if I sold to a developer," he admitted, "but I'd hate to see these apartments turned into luxury condos. They're good homes for working people, teachers, artists, young families just starting out. I'd like to keep them affordable." I told him about my background, about Cordelia's business, about my plans to maintain quality housing while preserving the character of the neighborhood. I didn't mention that my son and his family lived nearby, or that I had any personal investment in the area beyond appreciation for historic properties. William seemed pleased to find a buyer who understood the value of what he'd built. The purchase went smoothly, and I took ownership of the Meridian Apartments on a sunny day in May. 6 units, all occupied by good tenants who paid their rent on time and took care of their homes. The building needed some updating, new appliances, fresh paint, modern lighting, but the bones were solid. I hired contractors and began the careful work of improvement without displacement. I also hired a property management company, but I made it clear that I wanted to be involved in day-to-day decisions. This wasn't just an investment. It was a chance to create the kind of community I believed in. I visited the building regularly, getting to know the tenants, understanding their needs, making sure the improvements enhanced their quality of life rather than forcing them out. Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A was a nurse at OHSU who worked long shifts and appreciated having reliable heat and hot water. The couple in 1B were musicians who needed good soundproofing but couldn't afford market-rate rent in most neighborhoods. The young family in 3A had just moved to Portland and were relieved to find a landlord who understood that children sometimes make noise and create wear on an apartment. As I got to know my tenants and my new neighborhood, I also kept an eye on David and Vanessa. Not in a stalking way, but in the natural course of living nearby. I'd see them at the grocery store, at the coffee shop on their corner, pushing the twins on swings at the neighborhood park. They looked increasingly stressed as spring turned to summer. David's shoulders were always tense, and Vanessa had developed a habit of checking her phone constantly, as if waiting for bad news. Through my property manager, I learned that several buildings in the area were being sold to developers who planned to convert them to luxury condos. Longtime residents were being priced out, and the character of the neighborhood was shifting rapidly. David and Vanessa's mortgage, which had seemed manageable when they bought their house, was becoming a burden as property taxes increased, and David's company faced pressure from larger competitors. I felt no sympathy for their financial stress. They'd tried to solve their own problems by taking control of mine, assuming I'd be too weak or confused to object. They'd seen my vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a reason for genuine care. Now, they were discovering that vulnerability is a condition anyone can experience, and sympathy is something that has to be earned. The confrontation finally came on a warm evening in July. I was watering the flower boxes I'd installed outside the Meridian Apartments when I saw a familiar figure walking down the sidewalk. David, returning from his evening run, still wearing his tech company t-shirt and reflective shorts. He'd obviously seen my car parked outside the building several times and finally connected the dots. He stopped in front of me, breathing hard, His face flushed from exercise and something that might have been anger. "So this is where you've been," he said. "I should have known you'd end up in this neighborhood." I continued watering the marigolds, keeping my voice level. "Hello, David. How are Sophia and Emma? Don't pretend this is a coincidence. You bought a building 4 blocks from my house. You're deliberately inserting yourself into our lives." I set down the watering can and looked at my son. "I bought a good investment property in a neighborhood I like. I'm not inserting myself into anything. I'm living my life. With what money?" His voice was rising now, and I could see neighbors starting to notice. "Mom, this whole thing is insane. A year ago, you could barely manage your own house, and now you're suddenly a real estate investor. Someone is taking advantage of you. The same way you took advantage of me?" I asked quietly. That stopped him cold. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Mother and son, 2 people who'd once loved each other unconditionally, and now couldn't seem to find common ground. "I was trying to help you," he said finally. "You were struggling. You weren't taking care of yourself. Vanessa and I were worried about your safety." "You were worried about your liability," I corrected. "You were worried about what people would think if something happened to me. You were worried about the inconvenience of actually supporting me through a difficult time." "That's not fair, isn't it?" I picked up the watering can again. "David, you moved me into assisted living without asking what I wanted. You started making decisions about my property without my consent. You told people I was incompetent based on the fact that I had the flu and put my reading glasses in the wrong drawer. You thought I'd be grateful for being managed like a child. You thought I'd quietly disappear into that beige room and stop being your responsibility." I moved to the next set of flower boxes. "But I'm not disappearing, and I'm not anyone's burden. I'm a woman with resources and options and the right to make my own choices." David followed me along the sidewalk. "So you bought this building to prove a point to show us you're not helpless?" "I bought this building because it was a good investment and because I like providing quality housing for people who deserve it." I straightened up and looked him in the eye. "But if it also demonstrates that you seriously underestimated me, I'm fine with that as a side benefit." "Mom, this is crazy. You're 72 years old. You shouldn't be taking on this kind of responsibility." And there it was. The assumption that had driven everything they'd done to me. The belief that age automatically meant incapacity, that being older meant being lesser. The idea that I should be grateful for any life they were willing to allow me, no matter how small or constrained. "David," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I spent 43 years as a professional librarian. I managed budgets and staff and community programs. I researched complex questions and solved problems that required patience and skill. I raised you as a single mother after your father died, and I did a good job. I am not suddenly incompetent because I turned 70, or because I slipped on ice, or because I put my glasses somewhere you wouldn't have put them." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to ask me to check his homework, who trusted my judgment and valued my opinion. "I miss you," he said quietly. "But I don't understand what's happening. 6 months ago, you were my mom who needed help, and now you're this stranger who owns buildings and hires attorneys and acts like we're the enemy." My heart ached for him, for the confusion in his voice, for the loss that neither of us had wanted. "I miss you too," I said. "But I was never the helpless person you decided I was. I was temporarily struggling with specific challenges, and instead of helping me through them, you used them as evidence that I couldn't be trusted with my own life." "So what happens now?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful, who'd somehow become someone who could discard his mother when she became inconvenient. "Now you decide who you want to be," I said. "You can keep believing that age means incompetence and that love means control, Or you can accept that I'm the same person I've always been, just with different circumstances. And if I can't accept it, then you'll have to live with the consequences of throwing away a relationship with someone who loved you unconditionally. I picked up my watering can and headed toward the building entrance. I'm not disappearing, David. I'm not hiding. I'm 3 blocks away whenever you're ready to apologize for treating me like I didn't matter. I didn't look back as I walked into the building, but I heard him standing there for a long time before his footsteps finally faded down the sidewalk. The apology came 6 weeks later in the form of a letter slipped under my apartment door. David's handwriting, careful and deliberate, the way he used to write thank you notes when he was a child. Dear Mom, it began. I've been thinking about what you said about the choices Vanessa and I made and the assumptions we operated under. I've also been talking to a therapist about family dynamics and aging parents and the difference between helping and controlling. I want you to know that I understand now what we did wrong, and I'm sorry. The letter was 3 pages long, and I could tell he'd written multiple drafts. He acknowledged that they'd used my vulnerability against me, that they'd made decisions based on their own fears, rather than my actual needs. He admitted that Vanessa had been the driving force behind most of their actions, but he took responsibility for going along with her plans instead of advocating for me. I realize now that you were never the problem, he wrote. You were dealing with normal challenges that come with aging, and instead of supporting you through them, we decided you were incompetent. We took your trust and used it to justify taking your choices away. That was wrong, and I'm ashamed of it. He asked if he could see me if we could try to rebuild our relationship. He promised that he understood I was capable of making my own decisions and that he wouldn't try to override my judgment again. He even apologized for Vanessa explaining that she was dealing with her own fears about aging and had projected them onto our situation. I read the letter twice, then sat in my reading chair, looking out at the river, while I decided how to respond. Part of me wanted to make him work harder for forgiveness, to let him sit with his guilt a while longer. But another part of me missed my son, desperately missed the relationship we'd had before fear and manipulation had poisoned it. I called him that evening. I got your letter, I said when he answered. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. I've missed you, I said simply. I've missed Sophia and Emma. I've missed being part of your life. We've missed you too. The girls ask about you all the time. I've been trying to figure out how to explain why Grandma Eleanor doesn't come to visit anymore. You can tell them I moved to a new apartment, and I'd love to have them over for dinner sometime. I paused. You too, if you want to see how I'm living now. I'd like that. And Mom, I want you to know that I see you differently now. Not as someone who needs to be managed or protected, but as someone who's built an impressive life and deserves respect for it. We made plans for dinner the following weekend. David would bring the twins, and I'd cook their favorite spaghetti and meatballs. We'd start over carefully with the understanding that trust once broken takes time to rebuild. Vanessa, David explained, wouldn't be joining us immediately. She was struggling to accept that she'd been wrong about me, that her efforts to help had actually been harmful. She needed time to work through her own issues before she could face me honestly. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive her, but I was willing to leave that door open if she ever chose to walk through it. The dinner was awkward at first, all of us trying too hard to act normal. But Sophia and Emma, now 8 years old, were fascinated by my new apartment and full of questions about my building and my tenants. They wanted to know if I had a pool, no, and if I could see the river from my windows, yes, and if they could visit me again soon, absolutely. As the evening went on, David began to relax. He asked thoughtful questions about my property management work, about Cordelia's antique business, about my plans for the future. He listened like he used to when I'd tell him about interesting research projects at the library. He treated me like an adult whose opinions mattered. When they were getting ready to leave, Sophia hugged me tight and whispered, I like your new house, Grandma. It's much prettier than that other place. After they left, I stood at my kitchen window washing dishes and watching the city lights shimmer on the water. I thought about Cordelia, who'd seen something in me worth investing in. I thought about my tenants, who trusted me to maintain their homes with care and respect. I thought about David, who was learning to see his mother as a whole person rather than a problem to be solved. I was 72 years old, and I was just getting started. I had a business to run properties, to manage relationships, to rebuild. I had resources and knowledge and the confidence that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to thrive anyway. My son had tried to make me smaller than I was, but he'd failed. Instead, he'd forced me to discover just how large my life could be when I was the one making the choices. And now, finally, I was home.